The question of how we should understand and relate to Old Testament moral laws, or Old Testament laws generally, is one of the most complex questions in Christian ethics, and many people throughout history have made, I think, mistakes in this area that have been harmful. The conclusion that I have come to on this question is that, to start with, we should recognize that the Mosaic covenant, which began under Moses' leadership in Exodus 20, and where God gave these laws to the nation of Israel, that Mosaic covenant that began at Exodus 20 was terminated when Christ died, and Hebrews 8 and 9 are very clear about that. Christians are no longer directly subject to the laws of the Mosaic covenant, but instead we live under the provisions of the new covenant. But once we agree that the Mosaic covenant no longer has binding force on us today, we still have to realize that the Old Testament is a valuable source of ethical wisdom when we understand it in a way that's consistent with how the New Testament authors use the Old Testament for ethical teaching. The New Testament authors, for instance, they explicitly reaffirm all of the moral standards found in the Ten Commandments, but they don't reaffirm observance of the Sabbath as a requirement for New Covenant Christians, and so that's the one exception. There's also another important point that people don't always realize. When the New Testament talks about the Old Covenant, which is no longer in force for us, we have to realize that the Old Covenant doesn't refer to the whole Old Testament, but it refers to the Mosaic Covenant that began in Exodus 20. There is material in the Bible, in the book of Genesis and in the early chapters of Exodus, that have to do with teaching of right and wrong for all of life, for all of history. And then there's much in the Old Testament that isn't uniquely tied to the covenant with Israel. Much in the wisdom literature, such as Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, where there is general teaching about wisdom for life. And all of this, of course, is part of what Paul says in 2 Timothy 3:16, is all Scripture is profitable for training in righteousness.